The year is 331 BC and the armies of Alexander the Great and Darius III, the last king of the Achaemenid Empire, 7,000 companion cavalrymen, 6,000 elite Macedonian infantrymen. Upon hearing this, he had his army move to higher ground near a small village called Gaugamela, where they would form up to face the oncoming Persians. The Persian army got into position behind a small river that ran through the battlefield. According to Plutarch, they quickly drove the Greek mercenaries back. But they did not pursue them too far. Instead, they stopped after reaching some rising ground. At the same time, the rest of the Persian army started to advance. Even though they fought bravely, the sheer number of Persians was beginning to tell on them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the field, the Macedonian infantry were also beginning to struggle. The rest of the Persian army followed their example and fled the field. Darius abandoned his army and fled to the city of Susa, as well as a display of the power of the Macedonian state. It was a clash of civilizations, a battle between two of the greatest empires of the ancient world. The outcome of the battle would have a profound impact on the course of history. On the first day, the Persian army attempted to encircle and defeat the Macedonian center, but they were repelled. On the second day, Alexander's cavalry attacked the Persian immortals, breaking their formation and driving them back. On the third day, the remaining Persian forces were defeated and Darius fled. It marked the end of the Achaemenid Empire and the beginning of Alexander's empire. It was a clash of civilizations, a battle between two of the greatest empires of the ancient world. The outcome of the battle had a profound impact on the course of history. It is no wonder that the Battle of Gaugamela has been studied and celebrated by military leaders and historians throughout the ages. The Macedonian army was smaller but better trained and equipped. The Persian army was larger and more diverse, but less disciplined. The Persian Empire was effectively ended and Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to India. Alexander was hailed as a hero and his army was celebrated for their bravery and skill. The battle is considered to be one of the greatest battles in ancient history and has been studied and celebrated by military leaders and historians throughout the ages. Alexander's army was led by himself and his generals, including Ptolemy I, Parmenion, and Antipater. Darius's army was led by himself and his generals, including Hydarnes, Mazares, and Gobryas, where he would later be murdered by his own wife and children. Alexander pursued Darius, capturing his family and taking his treasure. The spoils of war were immense. Thousands of tents, countless treasures, and a huge amount of plunder were seized by the victors. He founded many cities and spread Greek culture and ideas throughout his empire. After his death in 323 BC, his empire was divided among his generals and the Hellenistic period began. The Hellenistic period was a time of cultural exchange between Greece and the East, and it lasted until the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC. For all their discipline and training, they simply could not hold off the immortals forever. One by one, their shields were broken and their ranks began to crumble. Seeing this, Alexander knew that he had to do something to help them. So he ordered Parmenion and Ptolemy to bring their cavalrymen back to the fight and lead a charge against the Persians to break their momentum. Moving in behind the immortals, with his elite cavalrymen at his side, he charged deep into the heart of the immortals, slaying all who stood before him. His presence inspired the Macedonians on the left wing to reform their ranks and renew their attack. And soon the immortals began to waver. He praised them for their courage and reminded them that their victory was a testament to their strength and determination. However, he also warned them not to become complacent, pointing out that the war was far from over and that there were still many challenges ahead of them. Alexander's warning proved to be prophetic as the war against Persia was far from over. Although the Battle of Gaugamela was a decisive victory for the Macedonians, it would take several more years to fully subdue the Achaemenid Empire. They had proven to be a tough nut to crack, but the arrival of the cavalrymen tipped the balance of power. Looking to cut off the Greek mercenaries and Macedonian infantry from the rest of Alexander's army, Parmenion said that he was the most experienced cavalry commander of all and that Ptolemy was unfit to lead because he was getting too old. Ptolemy, however, claimed that he was the best cavalry commander and that Parmenion was jealous because he didn't get to lead the cavalry. When Alexander heard about the argument, he simply told them both that they would lead the cavalry together, thus ending the dispute. Here, hidden from the enemy, King Darius and his generals reviewed their plan one last time. The battle would start with the immortals advancing across the river, seizing the high ground, and enveloping the Greek mercenaries in the middle. As the fighting continued, more and more immortals were slain, but they continued to come forward to fill the gaps in their ranks. This caused some of the Greek mercenaries to flee, but the Macedonian infantry held their ground. They leaned heavily on their long spears, forming a wall of overlapping shields that the Persians were unable to penetrate. Then the rest of the Persian army would move forward and destroy the rest of the Greek force. Alexander deployed his army in what was by now a familiar formation for him. The companion cavalrymen were placed on the right wing, while the elite Macedonian infantrymen known as the Cerysophiles were on the left. This caused confusion among the ranks of the immortals, breaking their formation. At the same time, Alexander led his own cavalrymen into the fray, driving the disarrayed immortals back across the river. These two forces were the cream of his crop, but also the two arms that suffered the most casualties during his many battles. So he kept them back from the front lines. Instead, in the center of his army and on the front lines, he placed the more expendable troops, the Greek mercenaries and some of his allied soldiers. And then a hodgepodge collection of assorted allies, he would attempt to encircle the Greek mercenaries, hoping that without their archers and light troops screening them, the Macedonian infantry would be unable to hold off the immortals, allowing Darius to roll up Alexander's center and destroy his army, which brings the total size of his army to around 40 to 50,000 men. Darius's army is much larger, though some sources say over 1 million, but that is almost certainly an exaggeration. It is still considerably larger than Alexander's force at around 80 to 100,000 soldiers, with around 10,000 of those being Persian immortals, an elite soldier type that we have already done a full breakdown on here, so make sure to check that out if you want to learn more about them. Are facing each other near the city of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia. This will be the last battle that Darius fights in. In fact, this will be the very last battle that Alexander ever fights in as well. And it will be one of the greatest battles in ancient history. Alexander's army consists of 20,000 Greek mercenaries. Alexander's army was camped near the banks of the Tigris River when he received word that Darius was approaching. Darius, for his part, wanted to replicate the tactics that had won him several victories against the Greeks before Alexander came along. Meanwhile, the fighting on the right wing was going poorly for Alexander. His cavalrymen had been pushed back across the river. As the cavalrymen reformed, Alexander took full advantage of the confusion in the Persian ranks. As the immortals began to fall back, now, after the dust had settled and the survivors of the battle had been taken care of, Alexander addressed his men. Still, the victory was a testament to the skill and bravery of Alexander and his men. It was a triumph of military strategy and tactics. The Battle of Gaugamela was a pivotal moment in history. It marked the end of the Achaemenid Empire and the beginning of Alexander's empire. The battle was fought in 331 BC between the armies of Alexander the Great of Macedon and Darius III of Persia. The battle was fought over the course of several days. The outcome of the battle was a decisive victory for Alexander and his army. In the wake of the battle, Alexander went on to conquer much of the Middle East and Central Asia. The Battle of Gaugamela was a turning point in ancient history. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more epic historical tales. Thank you for watching. What is up, everybody? It's me here with some historical insights on Alexander the Great's greatest battle, the Battle of Gaugamela against the Achaemenid Empire. As we are all aware, Alexander the Great was undefeated in battle, and this was his greatest test. But today we aren't going to talk about the battle itself. I am a historian, and I make weekly videos on all aspects of the ancient world, from military history to social history and everything else in between. If you like what you see here, please subscribe so that you can be notified every time I upload a new video. It took place in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, which is a flat, open plain, and absolute perfect ground for cavalry charges. That honor belongs to the nearby village of Apis. But thanks to his superior numbers, he didn't bother chasing after him. Instead, he camped on the other side of the river from Alexander and prepared for battle the following day. He could try to outflank Alexander by marching south, and then swinging around the river. He left the safety of his camp and moved his army further south to a small hill near the village of Apis. You see, as he pushed his troops onto the hill, he inadvertently split his army in two, allowing Alexander to slip his cavalry through the gap and surprise the Persians. Plutarch claimed that Alexander fought 70,000 Persians at the Battle of Issus. Now cut off from their allies, the Persian generals were forced to flee. Some tried to rally their troops and fight to the death, but most fled, including Darius himself. Despite being outnumbered, Alexander had won yet another battle. Here, he believed he could easily defend against any future Macedonian attacks. First of all, it marked the end of the Achaemenid Empire, the largest empire in the world at the time. Its collapse would lead to a power vacuum in the region that would last for centuries. Second, it showed the true strength of Alexander's army. Everyone thought that Darius's 500,000-strong army would be too much for the Macedonians, but Alexander had other plans. With his brilliant maneuvering, he turned a potential defeat into a rout. He broke one of the largest armies in the ancient world and defeated its king. It was a tactical masterpiece. Little did he know that his friend, the Persian satrap of Media, had taken the very same hill just 2 days prior, much to the dismay of the local villagers. See, that hill wasn't really great for defending. It was barely large enough to fit half of Darius's army, and the terrain was too uneven for cavalry charges. That is why Alexander had told his generals to leave the hill alone when they captured it. He knew that one day he would need it for his own army. Darius, however, did not. But this would take too much time, and he knew that Alexander would stop him again. He could try to reinforce his colleagues and link up with him, but where were they? No one knew. Even if he did find them, such a force would be too unwieldy to maneuver properly. After all, Darius's own army alone outnumbered Alexander's by at least 2-1. So that left only one option: try again, head back across the river, regroup and launch another assault. When the Persians awoke the next morning and attempted to cross the river, they were stopped in their tracks by the sight of those Macedonian fortifications. They couldn't go around them because of the terrain. They couldn't go over them because of the hill. They could only go through them. This was exactly what Alexander wanted. He knew that his fortifications wouldn't hold back the Persian cavalry for long, but they would buy his army some time. As soon as Darius committed his cavalry to the attack, Alexander gave the order to charge, and his men surged forward, cutting off the Persians' retreat. Alexander reached there first and decided to camp across the river from the village. On the opposite bank was a hill that overlooked the whole area, and it was covered with a thick woodlot. Just south of the hill was a stream that ran parallel to the river, creating a natural corridor through the forest. What Alexander did next would prove to be a brilliant move. He sent his cavalry across the river under the command of his close friend and general, Ptolemy I, and stationed them just south of the stream. Then he ordered that the rest of his army build fortifications along the riverbank, creating a literal roadblock that would prevent Darius's forces from crossing over and reaching his cavalry. At the same time, another general, Parmenion, was sent to the hilltop to establish another defensive line in reserve. Finally, with everything in its proper place, Alexander left for Gaugamela. But it was the 4th century BC, so there weren't exactly trees everywhere. There were, however, villages and hills nearby, not enough to hide an entire army, but enough to hide part of it. Alexander's brother, Philotas, was killed in the battle and his cavalry was almost completely wiped out. but it still forced Darius to abandon his pursuit and retreat back to his original camp. This was already a victory for Alexander. Not only did he destroy Darius's attempt to encircle him, but he also managed to bait the Persian king into abandoning his initial plans and waste valuable time in the process. This is why Alexander's decision to camp outside of the city of Gaugamela on the banks of the Tigris River was so crucial. His plan was to leave a portion of his troops behind to guard his camp, while he marched the rest of his army north to intercept Darius before the Persian king could join his generals. You can also follow me on social media or check out my page for exclusive content. And now let's get started. But more specifically how Alexander set up his army for this battle, because it is genius and definitely worth discussing. Before we get into the meat of the video though, let me introduce myself. Gaugamela is one of the most famous battles in all of history. The clash of two titans, Alexander the Great and Darius III of the Achaemenid Empire, who had sent his generals to defeat the Macedonian once and for all. Yet he failed. Why? Well, a few reasons, but one of them was Alexander's brilliant maneuverings in the days leading up to the battle. He knew that the Persians were superior in numbers, and he had to account for that. So, he did something genius. Let me explain. The first thing to understand about Gaugamela is the terrain. But Gaugamela is not where the battle took place. Meanwhile, when Darius finally arrived at Gaugamela, he found Alexander's abandoned camp. Of course, things didn't go quite as planned. Darius now had three options. Only this time, though, Darius made a critical mistake. This was the second blunder that proved fatal for Darius. So why is this battle so important? That being said, there is some debate over whether or not these numbers are accurate. Alexander's success at Gaugamela was due to a number of factors. First, he had a highly trained and disciplined army, composed of elite infantry and cavalry. Second, he was a brilliant tactician and strategist, able to read the battlefield and anticipate his enemy's moves. Third, he was lucky. Both Darius and his generals made critical mistakes that allowed Alexander to gain the upper hand. Had they played their cards right, the outcome of the battle could have been very different. After all, numbers do matter. Despite the size of the Persian army, Alexander the Great's name strikes fear in the hearts of his enemies, in addition to his charisma and ambition. His military genius led to Macedonia's emergence as a major power in the ancient world, thanks to his victories against the Achaemenids. The Persian Empire would never recover, and Alexander's legacy would live on for centuries to come. And with that ends yet another video. I hope you enjoyed this episode on Alexander's brilliant strategy at Gaugamela. If you did, please subscribe so that you can be notified every time I upload a new video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. In 331 BC, the Persian king Darius III was marching east with his army in order to put down rebellions in Babylon and Media. The long-serving general of the Persian royal army, Parmenion, urged caution and patience. But Darius, fueled by paranoia and a lust for conquest, wanted to punish the rebels swiftly. And so he decided to take a detour and attack the Greek city of Gaugamela. The Greeks prepared for them with archers and slingers positioned on the wall to repel their attackers. During the following months, the Persians tried every trick in the book, but Gaugamela would not fall. Frustrated by this embarrassing turn of events, Darius III ordered his army to leave their camp and lay siege to the city once again. They had poisoned their families and friends, burned their homes and stores, defeating the Persians on land at the Battle of the Hellespont, capturing Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. One big problem for the Persians was their lack of military discipline. Their horsemen were usually equipped with bows and arrows and acted as light cavalry, skirmishing the enemy and keeping them at a distance. This worked against the Greeks because their heavy infantry formations were slow and cumbersome and couldn't deal with mounted opponents. Why do you think the Persians lost at Gaugamela? Do you think they stood any chance against Alexander? And how would you have fought if you were Darius? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And remember, this is a small-scale production. Your support goes a long way. Thank you very much. But against Alexander's companion cavalry, the Persian horse archers were sitting ducks. Furthermore, unlike Alexander's companion cavalry, the Persian nobility weren't necessarily the best riders. Many of them preferred chariots. As we can see from a vase painting depicting the Battle of Gaugamela, most Persian officers ride in chariots just like the Egyptians. The failure of the cavalry had catastrophic consequences for the Persian army. Since they lacked heavy infantry, the cavalry was supposed to protect their flanks and stop enemy cavalry charges. Without their cavalry, the army had no way of defending itself. When Darius came to power, the vast majority of the royal guard consisted of non-Persians. Most of them were mercenaries who didn't really care about the king or the empire. Darius made a decision to replace them with his own people, a policy that paid dividends during the early stages of his reign. But it was ultimately disastrous. His reforms resulted in a demobilization of the army, leaving him without a standing army capable of resisting Alexander. Even worse, the Persian army became dependent on forced levies from the provinces whenever the king needed soldiers. This was a far cry from the old system, which provided the Achaemenids with a constant flow of fresh troops. And finally ending the Achaemenid Empire forever at the Battle of Gaugamela in October 330 BC. At that point, it looked like nothing could stop him. We don't know exactly how large the Persian army was, but it might have numbered around 100,000 men, including allied contingents. The army was split between Darius and his generals, and none of them could communicate directly with each other. Instead, they sent messages through the post houses of the satraps, which explains why vital information reached Darius 3 days late. Being outnumbered wasn't necessarily a death sentence. After all, the Persian army defeated the Greeks in superior numbers at the battles of the river and Bias. But the Achaemenids failed to capitalize on their victories, failed to coordinate their attacks, and ultimately paid for it with their lives. But just a few years later, while besieging the Indian city of Brytis, Alexander himself would die from a fever, possibly malaria, brought back from his campaigns in Asia. And most of them had taken their own lives. Only a few thousand managed to escape into the mountains. But Alexander had them rounded up and executed as well. The defenders of Gaugamela were rewarded with land and riches. The rest of the city was burnt to the ground. According to Plutarch, only one survivor remained, a young woman who had hidden herself in a tomb. When she heard the city had fallen, she crawled through the sewer system and escaped into the mountains. She lived the rest of her life as a hermit. By now, the Macedonian army under Alexander the Great was approaching rapidly. Though Darius had chosen Gaugamela because he thought it would discourage Alexander from pursuing him, it actually did quite the opposite. Now the Persians were trapped. Alexander laid siege to their supply depots and cut off their escape routes. For the besieged Persians, surrender was the only viable option. With no food left, women were eating grass and children were being sacrificed to keep the adults from doing the same. Finally, Darius agreed to surrender the city. Darius was ready to end his campaign right there and then, abandon his siege and retreat to Susa. However, that was far from an option. Not only would that be a huge embarrassment for him, but it would also be very bad for his health. He knew full well his subjects would see it as a sign of weakness and either rebel or refuse to fight for him. First, it was a severe blow to the prestige of the Persian Empire. Before the siege, the Persians were still hoping to win the war despite the defeats at the hands of Alexander. But after losing Gaugamela and all of their army and supplies stored in the city, the Achaemenids were on the run, and their defeat was imminent. Secondly, the loss of Gaugamela made it impossible for Darius to muster a new army and mount any meaningful resistance. In fact, according to Plutarch, many Persians surrendered to Alexander, stating they didn't want to serve a king who had lost even a single battle. Thirdly, the death of Gaugamela spelled the end of Western civilization for Persia. All those cities founded by the Greeks along the Persian Gulf and the Levant were now free from the threat of destruction by the Persians. They were allowed to keep their wealth, and were generally treated well by Alexander. Some of these cities, like Tyre, would even become part of his empire, something that would never have happened if the Persians had won. Lastly, The Persian royal treasury, which held the spoils of centuries of Achaemenid conquests, was now accessible to Alexander. It contained untold riches which financed his campaigns for years and allowed him to hire and equip thousands of soldiers. So, he had no choice but to stay and try to capture the city, hoping it would discourage Alexander the Great from pursuing him further into Persia. What could go wrong? Everything. Hello, everyone. This is the host and you're watching this channel. Today we are going to find out what happened at the Battle of Gaugamela, one of the largest battles in antiquity and the last major battle of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Battle of Gaugamela would be a costly one for both sides, but its impact on the Persian Empire would be devastating. As Darius marched his army towards Gaugamela, Parmenion tried to dissuade him from attacking the city, which was heavily fortified. But the king was eager to crush the rebellion and get back to punishing the Greeks. And so they began their siege. The situation was so dire that Darius had to start selling his valuables to feed his men. Still, the king was reluctant to end his campaign without achieving at least some kind of victory. Gaugamela was too important strategically to let slip away. So, he resolved to give it one final push before retreating. If that failed, he would head south toward Babylonia, where he hoped to raise enough supplies to keep his army fed. Darius deployed siege towers, catapults, and battering rams against the city walls. As winter approached, supplies started getting scarce and the Persian army suffered from hunger and cold. Then in the beginning of 330 BC, just as the spring rains began, however, when the Macedonians entered Gaugamela, they found the Persians had killed themselves rather than submit to Alexander. Alexander continued his campaign, destroying the Persian navy at the Battle of the River. But why was the Battle of Gaugamela such a turning point in the war? But how did the Persians lose? Another reason for the Persian loss was the failure of their cavalry. The last factor contributing to the Persian defeat was the breakdown of communications within the army. What do you think?